In today's episode, HOA member doesn't know the rules as well as he thinks. Revenge of the construction workers. One-party consent recordings, the kryptonite of asshole supervisors. So let's get started. HOA member doesn't know the rules as well as he thinks. This story primarily takes place between me and shitty neighbor who is a member of my community's HOA. Sorry if it's a bit long. As a bit of background, me and my 3 roommates moved into a housing community that is basically just a bunch of cookie-cutter townhomes. All of these homes have garages that open onto streets that wind through the community. This is important later, with your front door opening to a path on the other side of your house. There are also some free parking spots on the edge of the community where there are no houses. When we first moved in, we quickly found out that parking could be a bit of a pain during the day, especially when people had guests during the weekend. Now my roommates and I admittedly have more cars than the average family. Because we usually have to commute for work, we each have one. We try to make parking easier by using the garage, but we all have tons of sporting equipment, so we can usually only get one car in the garage. When all the parking in all the free spots is full, we just park our cars right up against the garage and leave them there during the day or overnight. We'd seen other neighbors do it, and it still left ample room for people driving on the street to get by. Well, one day shitty neighbor come up while my roommates and I are in the garage organizing some stuff and tells us that we can't park there overnight as it's against community rules. Before we had a chance to respond, he added, "And if you do it again, I will personally make sure you're towed." His first comment was pretty reasonable. We just moved in and didn't know that rule. But his second comment really just made him sound like an ass and wasn't necessary. One of my roommates simply responded that we didn't know as we just moved in, and we wouldn't park there overnight anymore. Well, shitty neighbor, clearly trying to assert his dominance, responded with, "Good. You better not, because I'll be watching." Well, from then on we did follow those rules. If we parked in front of our garage during the day, we would make sure to move before we went to sleep. This worked out for a while until one faithful day. One of my roommates stopped by quickly after work to grab some dinner and clothes before heading to his girlfriend's. This was around 7 p.m., so he just parked up against the garage as it would be quicker than the parking spaces. Plus, it was early enough that he didn't think he'd get towed. Around 8 p.m. he went to head out and his car was gone. Guess who was there though? Shitty neighbor standing right outside. Immediately he said to my roommates, "Told you you were going to get towed if you parked here again." SN and my roommate argued for a bit before my roommate came back inside and calls the car lot. Well, it ends up they're closed, so he'll have to get his car in the morning. The kicker? They're going to charge him an overnight fee. All in all, it comes out to $500, which isn't a small amount of money for us. This neighbor has been an ass to us since we moved in, and even though it wasn't my car that was towed, I took this personally. To make sure we didn't get towed again, we decided to read the community rules, and lo and behold, we found out that the street in front of the garage is actually considered a fire lane, and no one is supposed to park there at any point during the day. Between shitty neighbor treating us like shit and the fact that we could get him yelling at his wife every night, not a big detail to the story, but just wanted to say to add to my point that this guy just sucked, I start to plan my revenge. Since quarantine started, I've been able to work from home, and my desk conveniently looks out onto the street between the houses. This means that I can clearly see shitty neighbor's garage. I start to take notice of when he parks his car out in front of his garage. For about 2 weeks I noticed that he would come home around 1 p.m. and leave again at 2 p.m. On the 3rd week I decided I would begin the revenge. On Monday, true to his schedule, he stopped by around 1. After about 10 minutes I gave the tow company a call and said that he was parked in the fire lane, and if they could come and remove his car. 20 minutes later a tow truck rolled up, hooked his car up, and towed it off. About 15 minutes later shitty neighbor came out, and I could hear him start to yell back into his house, presumably at his wife. He then left and didn't come back until later that evening after he'd gotten his car. Now it was funny to do this, and I made sure to send snaps to my roommates who don't work from home, but I wasn't done yet. See, this jackass apparently didn't learn the first time because literally the next day he parks in front of his garage again. What do I do? Well, the exact same thing as the day before, of course. Again, SN come out, realizes his car is gone, yells at his wife, and then goes to get it. Now after this time he is a bit smarter and parks in an actual spot before going in to get his lunch or whatever it is he does there midday. He does this for about 2 weeks before he decides that it's okay to park in front of his garage again. Well, who is still sitting at their desk every day and notices this immediately? Well, me, of course. And being the concerned resident that I am, I immediately call the tow company and off his car goes again. And again this is met with yelling. I wish that this had a more satisfying ending, but after this third time I decided I would stop, because I genuinely felt bad for his wife, who he seemed to do most of the yelling at as if it was her fault that he was a dumbass. What I can tell you is that it had definitely cost him over $1,000. If he hadn't gotten my roommate's car towed, then we wouldn't have ever found that fun little rule. The best part was that a number of my neighbors would have their cars parked there at the same time, and they'd never have their cars towed, which made it all the better when his was. We have had a number of other encounters that with him in the time since this happened, and I have another story that involves the actual HOA that I'll probably write later. That one is still ongoing though, so we'll see how it ends up. Revenge of the construction workers. I am a teacher, and when I was younger, I would take summer jobs to supplement my income. One summer, I worked for a bricklayer named Jerry and heard an amazing story. I worked for Jerry in the mid-90s, so the story either happened in the early 90s or in the 80s. Here goes. The setting for the story was a community of small rural towns, which had only one brick contractor. Jerry began his career as a bricklayer working for this contractor, a real jerk. Jerk and Jerk's son, adult working the business with his father, would harass, belittle, and humiliate all their employees on a regular basis. No work was ever good enough and employees were told they weren't worth what they were paid. Not only did Jerk mistreat his employees, but he was equally rude to other subcontractors and to the general contractors who hired him. Since he was the only bricklayer in the community, there was nothing anyone could do about it. Needless to say, the turnover rate for the brick business was very high. The only person that stuck with Jerk and company was Jerry. Jerry told me that his father had instilled a self-confidence in him that Jerry could do anything he set his mind to do, and that he should not evaluate himself according to what others said, but rather by the facts. Although Jerry was belittled by Jerk and son as were all other employees, Jerry was becoming a very good bricklayer. Jerry knew he was good. Jerk knew Jerry was good, but Jerk didn't know that Jerry knew he was good. Not only was Jerry a good bricklayer, he was very respectful to the boss who disrespected him. Jerk thought that Jerry was a naive pushover who was buying his head games. That would prove to be a huge mistake on his part. One day, Jerry was doing an exceptionally good job of laying brick. Not only was his craftsmanship amazing, he was laying brick at a high rate of speed, so that he was making his boss lots of money. Of course, Jerk and son were belittling his work as though he was doing the very opposite. This scenario was being observed by the general contractor of the project. After work that day, the general contractor asked Jerry to stay behind so he could talk to him. As did every other construction worker in the community, general contractor hated working with Jerk. General contractor told Jerry that he had heard Jerk and son belittling him, and told him that he disagreed with everything Jerk was saying. He asked Jerry if he had ever considered going into business for himself. Jerry said that he would like to do that someday. General contractor then said that he would loan Jerry the money to buy a mixer, the most expensive piece of equipment needed to start a brick business, if Jerry would indeed start said business. The only hitch was that Jerry would need to pay for the mixer whenever he could, and that he would subcontract under general contractor. Jerry agreed to those terms and prepared to begin his new venture. Jerry respectfully told Jerk and son his plans and gave his notice. The two mocked Jerry ruthlessly and laughed him to scorn. Jerk told Jerry, "You'll be back in 2 months," begging to return to your job. "You'll never make it as a subcontractor." 2 months later, rather than collapsing as Jerk predicted, Jerry was still in business and going strong. 1 year later, Jerry's business was booming, and a drunk Jerk showed up at Jerry's house and begged him to come back to work with Jerk and Son. "Jerry, you're the best employee I ever had." Jerry replied, "Why didn't you ever tell me that when I was working for you?" Jerk couldn't answer the question, and Jerry obviously didn't accept the offer for employment. 2 years after beginning his entrepreneurial adventure, Jerry heard that Jerk and Son went out of business. Jerry said that he never intended to harm Jerk and Son when he accepted General Contractor's offer. He said that looking back on things, he realized that he had become Jerk's greatest nightmare. "I can't say that General Contractor intended no harm. I thought the most amazing thing about the story was how that Jerry maintained his self-esteem in spite of all the ridicule. I also gained a respect for Jerry's father, who instilled an unshakable self-confidence in Jerry." One-party consent recordings, the kryptonite of asshole supervisors. I'm a paramedic, and after many years of working regular ground ambulance, I decided I had enough. My whole career, I was either a glorified Uber driver, being spit on by drunks, bit by meth heads, or chauffeuring people between hospitals, though once in a blue moon I saved a life. There isn't a lot of different jobs you can parlay an EMS career into, so I elected to move into the private sector, and got a job doing basically the same thing at a mine in a remote environment. Worked 2 weeks straight with 2 weeks off, less stress, and an enviable salary. On the surface, this was a sweet gig, almost heaven compared to the regular stretcher jockey job I came from, and it would have been such if not for the absolute psychopath who managed the EMS services out there. I didn't work directly from the mine's operator, instead I was employed by a contractor. The coordinator, my local boss, as he was called, was a golden boy as far as the mine company was concerned. I admit he could be charming, quite adept at impersonating a human being actually. It wasn't long before I discovered he reserved decency for everyone but his subordinates. His behavior started out as petty micromanaging, which was irritating, but then progressed to insults, put-downs, name-calling, "Hey dumbass" was his usual way to get my attention, and outright hostility. The man clearly enjoyed being a small-time workplace despot, and knew he could get away with it because of his reputation with our paymasters. It was around the 2-month mark before I really warmed up to my coworkers. There were 8 of us, including myself and the dipshit in chief, and not single one of them spoke a nice word about him. Most were resigned to him acting like a massive cunt because the 2-week holiday every month along with the pay rate. They also told me every complaint only fell on deaf ears, provoked retaliation, and again his relationship with the client made him nigh untouchable. This is when I started recording everything, and did so with these 2 assumptions. 1. The company would only act with serious proof of malfeasance. 2. His acts of bastardry would only escalate. Neither assumption proved false. I had nearly 3 months of audio tapes of him being Judd his regular whole self before he went too far. About a week into the shift, I showed up to our station and was called into his office only to be informed I was being let go and my replacement would be there in a few hours. I was to go back to our accommodations, pack my shit up and report back there. Well, *CK I thought before doing as I was bidden. Upon arriving back to the office with my suitcases, this sadist started laughing and said, "No one's coming to replace you. You're so *King gullible." It was a mock firing, and I'm sure he feverishly jacked himself off to it later that night. I was livid and let loose on him, finally ending a tirade with a malicious hint. Can you imagine what the office would do if they could have heard all this bullshit? Unrepentant to the last, he coldly stared at me before replying, "Can you imagine what they would do if a bunch of empty beer cans turned up and I told the office I saw you drinking?" Having recorded all this and knowing my glorious victory was assured, I feigned capitulation to carry on with my day. My first day off, I sent in a detailed letter to the company along with recordings, and as expected they fired his ass. What came after was righteous cackling laughter. 4 hours. I wonder, is this how Napoleon felt after winning at Austerlitz? Thanks for watching.